Thorn Wilder stood 7 feet tall and commanded every inch of his 12,000-acre ranch with an iron fist. But when the soft-spoken schoolteacher began reading poetry under his grandmother's sycamore tree, something cracked inside the man they called Stoneface. For 30 years, not a single tear had escaped his steel-gray eyes, not even when lightning struck his prize stallion or when drought threatened to destroy everything he'd built. But one morning, as Ella Mae's gentle voice carried verses about love and loss across the Texas wind, the giant cowboy felt something he thought was buried forever. A warmth spreading down his weathered cheek that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wilder ranch as Thorn guided his black stallion, Midnight, through the pastures where 1,000 head of cattle grazed peacefully. At 42 years old, he had built the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, transforming what had been his grandfather's modest homestead into an empire that stretched as far as the eye could see. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, the giant cowboy who never smiled, never showed weakness, and never, ever shed a tear. The nickname, Stoneface, had followed him since his teenage years, earned not through cruelty, but through an unwavering stoicism that both impressed and intimidated everyone who crossed his path. Ranch hands spoke of him in hushed tones, respecting his fairness but fearing his silence. In town, shopkeepers and bankers treated him with the deference reserved for royalty, knowing that his decisions could make or break the local economy. Yet despite all his success and influence, Thorn Wilder remained a mystery, a man whose emotions seemed as impenetrable as the granite cliffs that bordered his property. The transformation had begun 30 years earlier, on a day that remained burned into his memory despite his best efforts to forget it. At 12 years old, Thorn had been a different child entirely, quick to laugh and even quicker to cry when his feelings were hurt. He had loved his parents with the fierce devotion that only a child can possess, following his father around the ranch like a devoted shadow and running to his mother's arms whenever the world seemed too harsh or confusing. Then came the accident that changed everything. A flash flood had swept through the county during what should have been a routine trip to town, catching his parents' truck on a bridge that had weathered countless storms but couldn't withstand the fury of that particular deluge. The county sheriff had arrived at the ranch the next morning, his hat in his hands and his eyes filled with the kind of sorrow that no words could adequately express. Thorn had cried then, harder than he had ever cried in his young life. He had sobbed until his throat was raw and his eyes were swollen shut, grieving not just for his parents, but for the security and love that had been ripped away in an instant. The tears had flowed for 3 days straight, during the funeral arrangements, during the service itself, and during the long nights when he lay in his empty house wondering how he would survive without them. But on the 4th day, something had shifted inside him. As he stood beside the twin graves in the family cemetery, watching the last mourners drift away and leave him alone with his overwhelming grief, young Thorn had made a silent vow. He would never again allow himself to be so vulnerable, so broken by circumstances beyond his control. The tears stopped flowing that day, and they had never returned, not once in the 3 decades that followed. His grandfather had tried to reach him during those early years, the old man's weathered hands gentle as he attempted to coax some emotion from his stone-faced grandson. But Thorn had rebuilt himself from the ground up, constructing walls around his heart that proved impenetrable to every form of human connection. He had thrown himself into learning the ranch business with an intensity that both impressed and worried his grandfather, mastering skills that took other men years to develop and showing a natural aptitude for leadership that belied his young age. By the time he turned 18, Thorn had already taken over most of the ranch operations, his grandfather content to spend his remaining years watching his grandson transform their modest cattle operation into RAF. Something truly remarkable. The old man had passed away peacefully in his sleep 5 years later, leaving Thorn as the sole heir to a legacy that had been 3 generations in the making. Now, as he rode through the morning mist that clung to the valley floors, Thorn reflected on the empire he had built through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to remain focused on his goals. The Wilder Ranch employed 63 full-time workers, supported half the businesses in the nearby town of Cedar Falls, and had earned him a reputation that extended far beyond the borders of Texas. Cattle buyers from as far away as Chicago made pilgrimages to his ranch, knowing that Wilder beef represented the gold standard in quality and consistency. Yet for all his material success, Thorne lived a life of profound isolation. He occupied the same house where he had grown up, though he had expanded and renovated it over the years until it resembled a fortress more than a home. The walls were lined with awards and photographs documenting his achievements, but there were no pictures of friends or family, no personal mementos that might reveal the man behind the legend. The ranch hands respected him, and the townspeople admired him, but nobody truly knew him. He kept his relationships strictly professional, paying his employees well and treating them fairly while maintaining a distance that prevented any real intimacy from developing. Women had tried to penetrate his defenses over the years, drawn by his success and intrigued by his mysterious nature, but Thorne had learned to deflect their advances with the same efficiency he brought to all aspects of his cause. Life. This morning routine had remained unchanged for more than a decade, the solitary ride through his property serving as both inspection and meditation. He knew every fence post and watering hole, every seasonal pattern of the grass, and every hiding spot favored by the wildlife that shared his land. The predictability of it all brought him a measure of peace, the certainty that in this corner of the world, at least, he maintained complete control. But as he approached the old sycamore tree that marked the eastern boundary of his property, Thorne noticed something that disrupted his carefully ordered world. Smoke was rising from the chimney of the abandoned schoolhouse that sat on the far edge of his land, and he could see signs of recent activity around the building that had stood empty for more than 20 years. The schoolhouse had been built by his great-grandfather in the 1890 NS, intended to serve the children of ranch families scattered across the vast distances of rural Texas. For decades it had fulfilled that purpose, housing teachers who boarded with local families and providing education to generations of cowboy children who might otherwise have grown up illiterate. But as the population shifted to larger towns and transportation improved, the little school had gradually become obsolete, finally closing its doors for the last time when Thorne was still a teenager. Since then, it had served mainly as a storage building and occasional shelter for travelers caught in bad weather. Thorne had maintained the structure out of respect for his family's history, but he had never seriously considered finding a new use for it. Now, as he guided Midnight closer to investigate, he felt a stirring of curiosity that was unusual for a man who typically approached life with the certainty of someone who had seen everything before. The schoolhouse looked better than it had in years, with fresh paint on the shutters and new glass in windows that had been boarded up for decades. A small garden had been planted beside the front steps, with rows of vegetables that spoke of someone's intention to stay for more than just a few days. Most surprising of all, sheets and towels hung from a clothesline stretched between two oak trees, fluttering in the morning breeze like flags of domestic permanence. As Thorne sat on his horse considering this unexpected development, the front door of the schoolhouse opened and a woman emerged carrying a wicker basket. She was small and slight, probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and moved with a grace that seemed almost musical. She wore a simple blue dress that suggested practicality rather than vanity, and when she looked up and noticed him watching her, she offered a smile that was both surprised and genuinely welcoming. "Good morning," she called out, setting down her basket and walking toward him with the confident stride of someone accustomed to meeting strangers. "You must be Mr. Wilder. I've been hoping to meet you." Thorne dismounted slowly, his natural caution warring with a curiosity that he couldn't quite suppress. Up close, the woman was even more striking than she had appeared from a distance, with green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and a face that seemed incapable of hiding her emotions. Everything about her was the opposite of his own carefully controlled demeanor, from her animated expressions to the way she gestured with her hands as she spoke. "I'm Ella Mae Patterson," she continued, extending her hand with the straightforward confidence of someone who had never learned to be intimidated by powerful men. "I hope you don't mind that I've made myself at home in your schoolhouse. I left several messages with your ranch manager about arranging proper payment for the rent." Thorne found himself momentarily at a loss for words. an unusual experience for a man who had built his reputation on always knowing exactly what to say in any situation. He shook her offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and the warmth that seemed to radiate from her skin like sunshine. "Ma'am," he said finally, falling back on the formal politeness that had served him well in countless business dealings. "I wasn't aware that anyone had requested permission to use the building." Ella's smile faltered slightly, but her eyes remained bright with hope. "Oh, dear. I was afraid there might have been some miscommunication. I wrote to you several weeks ago, explaining my situation and asking about the possibility of renting the schoolhouse. When I didn't hear back, I assumed that silence meant consent, which I realize now was presumptuous of me." She paused, studying his face with the kind of direct attention that made Thorne distinctly uncomfortable. Most people found his steady gaze intimidating and quickly looked away, but Ella seemed genuinely interested in understanding what he was thinking. "I'm a teacher," she continued, her voice taking on a note of earnest explanation. "I've been hired by the county to establish a new school program for the children in this area, many of whom have been traveling more than an hour each way to attend classes in Cedar Falls. The county board thought it would be more efficient to reopen some of the old rural schools, and when I saw your beautiful building, I knew it would be perfect." Thorne processed this information with the methodical approach he brought to all unexpected developments. The county's decision made sense from a practical standpoint, as several new families had moved into the area in recent years, drawn by jobs at his ranch and others like it. The children were indeed facing long commutes that limited their ability to participate in after-school activities and placed a burden on their parents. "The county should have contacted me directly about this arrangement," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "But I suppose what's done is done. How long do you intend to stay?" "The contract is for 1 school year initially, with the possibility of renewal if the program proves successful," Ella replied, her relief at his apparent acceptance evident in her relaxed posture. "I hope to start classes next week, assuming I can finish preparing the classroom and arrange for supplies to be delivered." She gestured toward the schoolhouse with obvious pride in what she had accomplished. "I've been working on it for the past 2 weeks, trying to restore it to something approaching its original condition. It's a magnificent building, Mr. Wilder. Your family clearly believed in the importance of education." Thorne felt an unexpected stirring of something that might have been pride at her praise of his family's legacy. The schoolhouse had indeed been built with care and attention to detail, constructed from the finest materials available, and designed to last for generations. His great-grandfather had often spoken of education as the foundation of civilization, believing that knowledge was the one inheritance that could never be stolen or squandered. "What arrangements have you made for payment?" he asked, falling back on business matters as a way to regain his equilibrium. Ella's expression became slightly embarrassed, and she clasped her hands together in a gesture that Thorne found oddly endearing. "Well, that's where things get a bit complicated. The county's budget for this program is quite limited, and they've allocated most of it for supplies and my modest salary. I was hoping we might work out some sort of alternative arrangement for the rent." She hurried on before he could respond, clearly nervous about his reaction to her proposal. "I'm quite handy around the house, and I noticed that this beautiful place could use some attention to the landscaping and general maintenance. I'm also an excellent cook, if that might be of any value. I was thinking perhaps I could provide services in lieu of traditional payment." Thorne found himself in the unusual position of not knowing how to respond. In his business dealings, everything was straightforward, negotiated in clear terms, and documented with contracts that left no room for misunderstanding. But Ella's proposal fell outside the boundaries of his normal experience, requiring him to make decisions based on factors that couldn't be quantified or reduced to simple profit and loss calculations. The practical part of his mind recognized that her offer made sense. The schoolhouse had indeed been neglected, and while he maintained the structure itself, the surrounding grounds had been left to grow wild. His housekeeper came only twice a week and focused mainly on the essential cleaning, leaving little time for the kind of detailed attention that would make his home truly comfortable. But accepting Ella's proposal would mean allowing her to become integrated into his daily routine in ways that made him profoundly uncomfortable. For decades, he had structured his life to minimize unexpected interactions, and maintain the emotional distance that had served as his protection against the unpredictable pain of human connection. "I'll consider your proposal," he said finally, mounting midnight with the fluid grace of someone who had been writing since childhood. "In the meantime, you can remain in the schoolhouse while we work out the details." Ella's face lit up with genuine gratitude, and she clapped her hands together in a gesture of pure joy that caught Thorne completely off guard. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Wilder. You won't regret this decision, I promise. I'll work very hard to prove that I'm worthy of your trust." As Thorne rode away from the schoolhouse, he found himself glancing back more than once to watch Ella as she returned to her work in the garden. There was something about her enthusiasm and genuine warmth that stirred feelings he had thought were permanently buried, creating a sense of unease that followed him for the rest of his morning ride. Over the next several days, Thorne found his routine disrupted in ways both subtle and profound. The smoke from the schoolhouse chimney had become a constant presence on the horizon, a visible reminder of the change that had entered his carefully ordered world. More than once, he had altered his usual route to avoid riding too close to the building, telling himself that he was simply being considerate of Ella's privacy while refusing to acknowledge his own discomfort with the situation. But avoidance proved impossible when Ella appeared at his front door the following Wednesday morning, carrying a covered basket that filled the air with the most delicious aromas he had encountered in years. She wore the same simple style of dress he had seen before, but this one was a soft yellow that complemented her auburn hair and made her green eyes seem even more vibrant. "Good morning, Mr. Wilder," she said when he opened the door, her smile as bright as the morning sun. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to bring you something as a small token of my appreciation for your kindness." Thorne stood in his doorway feeling awkward and uncertain, conditions that were foreign to his usual experience. His house was immaculately maintained, but sterile, designed more for functionality than comfort, and the idea of inviting a virtual stranger inside felt like a violation of the sanctuary he had created for Rob himself. "That's very thoughtful of you, Miss Patterson," he said, accepting the basket with hands that seemed unusually clumsy. "But it wasn't necessary." "Please, call me Ella," she replied, her informal manner a stark contrast to the careful formality that governed most of his interactions. "And it was absolutely necessary. You're providing me with not just a place to live and work, but the opportunity to pursue my calling as a teacher. That deserves recognition." She gestured toward the basket with obvious pride in her work. "I've made apple cinnamon muffins, buttermilk biscuits, and a jar of my grandmother's strawberry preserves. I hope you'll enjoy them." The aromas rising from the basket were making Thorne's mouth water despite his discomfort with the situation. His meals typically consisted of simple fare, prepared by his part-time housekeeper, or reheated leftovers from his infrequent trips to town. The idea of food prepared with care and attention to flavor, rather than mere sustenance, held an appeal that he found difficult to resist. "Thank you," he said again, his limited social skills leaving him struggling for appropriate words. "This is very kind." Ella seemed to sense his discomfort and made no move to prolong the interaction, though her eyes lingered on his face with the kind of perceptive attention that made him feel oddly transparent. "I'll let you get back to your morning routine," she said. "But I hope you know that if you ever need anything at all, you only have to ask." As she walked back toward the schoolhouse, Thorne found himself watching her departure with the same fascination that he might observe an exotic bird that had unexpectedly appeared in his familiar landscape. Everything about Ella seemed to operate according to different rules than those that governed his world, from her easy emotional expression to her apparent inability to maintain the careful social distance that he considered essential for survival. The contents of her basket proved to be even more delicious than their aroma had promised. The muffins were perfectly spiced and tender, the biscuits flaky and buttery, and the preserves sweet with just enough tartness to provide complexity. As Thorne ate his breakfast, he found himself remembering meals from his childhood, when his mother had filled their kitchen with similar aromas, and the simple act of eating had been about more than mere sustenance. The memory caught him off guard, breaking through defenses that he had spent decades constructing. For a moment, he could almost hear his mother's laughter and feel the warmth of her hand ruffling his hair as she placed a plate of fresh-baked cookies in front of him. The sensation was so vivid that he actually looked around his empty kitchen, half expecting to see her standing by the stove with her gentle smile and flour-dusted apron. But the kitchen remained empty, exactly as it had been for the past 23 years since his grandfather's death. The silence that usually brought him comfort now seemed oppressive, filled with the absence of voices and laughter that had once made this house a home, rather than merely a place to sleep and store his possessions. Shaking off these unwelcome reflections, Thorne finished his breakfast and prepared for his daily inspection of the ranch. But as he saddled Midnight and began his familiar route, he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Ella and the small disruption she had created in his carefully controlled existence. The school had officially opened the previous Monday, and already the signs of change were evident throughout the area. Children who had once spent hours each day traveling to and from Cedar Falls were now able to walk or ride short distances to their neighborhood school. Parents who had struggled to balance work schedules with transportation responsibilities were discovering new freedom and flexibility in their daily routines. More than that, the schoolhouse had become a gathering point for the scattered community, a place where families met and friendships developed among people who had previously known each other only in passing. Thorne had observed this transformation from a distance, noting the increased traffic on the roads that bordered his property and the sounds of children's laughter that carried across the fields during recess periods. Part of him appreciated the practical benefits of these changes. Happy employees were productive employees, and the convenience of local education was likely to help him retain good workers who might otherwise have moved closer to town. But another part of him felt unsettled by the disruption to his solitary existence, the knowledge that his private kingdom was no longer as isolated as it had once been. These conflicting feelings came to a head the following Friday, when Thorne discovered Ella sitting beneath the old sycamore tree that marked the eastern boundary of his property. He had been riding fence that morning, checking for damage from the previous night's storm, when he spotted her familiar figure in the shade of the massive tree. She was reading aloud from a small leather-bound book, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. At first, Thorne assumed she was preparing lessons for her students, but as he drew closer, he realized that she was alone, reading for her own pleasure rather than for any practical purpose. The sycamore had been planted by his grandmother more than 70 years earlier, intended as a memorial to a baby brother who had died in infancy. Over the decades, it had grown into a magnificent specimen, its broad canopy providing shade for cattle during the hot summer months and serving as a landmark that could be seen for miles in any direction. Thorne had many memories associated with the tree, most of them painful reminders of the family life that had been stripped away from him at such a young age. His parents had often brought him here for picnics, spreading blankets in the shade, while his mother read stories and his father pointed out different species of birds and wildflowers. After their deaths, he had avoided the spot entirely, finding the associations too difficult to bear. But now, as he watched Ella sitting in the same spot where his family had once gathered, Thorne felt drawn forward by a curiosity that overcame his usual caution. He dismounted at a distance that would allow him to listen without intruding, tying Midnight's reins to a fence post and settling himself against a boulder where he could observe without being seen. Ella's voice was musical and expressive, bringing life to the words she read with an emotion that seemed to flow directly from her heart. She was reading poetry, Thorne realized, verses about love and loss, hope and sorrow, all the vast range of human experience that he had spent decades trying to avoid. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that there was in me an invincible summer, she read, her voice soft but clear in the morning stillness. The words seemed to hang in the air like musical notes, creating harmonies that resonated with something deep inside Thorne's carefully guarded soul. She continued reading, moving from one poem to another with the fluid grace of someone who had memorized the words but still found fresh meaning in their expression. There were verses about courage and resilience, about the beauty found in simple moments, about the connections that bind all living things together in ways both seen and unseen. As Thorne listened, he found himself drawn into the rhythm and flow of the language, experiencing emotions that he had thought were permanently buried beneath the practical concerns of daily life. The poetry spoke of experiences that were universal, feelings that connected all human beings regardless of their circumstances or the walls they had built around their hearts. One poem in particular seemed to reach him with unusual power, verses about a man who had forgotten how to feel until he encountered someone whose presence reminded him of all he had lost and all he might yet discover. He had learned to live with silence, to make peace with emptiness, but when she spoke, the words became music, and when she smiled, the world remembered color. Ella Reed, her voice carrying a note of wistful longing that seemed to echo his own forgotten dreams. For the first time in 30 years, Thorne felt his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. The emotion that he had worked so hard to suppress was rising within him like water behind a failing dam, threatening to overflow the boundaries he had established to keep himself safe. And then it happened, the moment that would change everything that followed. As Ella read a verse about healing and hope, about the possibility of learning to love again after profound loss, Thorne felt something warm and wet sliding down his cheek. A tear. The first tear he had shed since standing beside his parents' graves 3 decades earlier. The sensation was so foreign that he reached up to touch his face, hardly believing what he was experiencing. The tear felt hot against his weathered skin, like a drop of liquid fire that burned away years of careful emotional numbness. More tears followed, a slow trickle at first, and then a steady stream, as 30 years of suppressed grief and longing found their release. Thorne sat frozen behind his boulder, overwhelmed by the intensity of feelings that he had thought were permanently buried. He wept for his parents, finally allowing himself to truly mourn their loss, rather than simply accepting it as an unchangeable fact. He wept for the lonely years that had followed, for the friendships he had never allowed himself to form, and the love he had never permitted himself to experience. He wept for the man he might have been, if fear had not shaped him into something hard and unyielding. But most of all, he wept for the recognition that it was not too late, that somewhere beneath the layers of protective ice he had built around his heart, there remained the capacity for warmth and connection that he had thought was lost forever. Ella continued reading, unaware of the profound transformation she was witnessing in her hidden audience. Her voice carried the same musical quality that had first drawn his attention, but now Thorne heard it differently, not just as sound, but as a bridge between the isolation he had known and the possibility of something richer and more meaningful. When she finally closed her book and prepared to return to the schoolhouse, Thorne remained hidden until she was safely out of sight. Only then did he allow himself to emerge from his concealment, his face still wet with tears and his hands shaking slightly from the emotional intensity of what he had experienced. The ride back to his house passed in a blur of confused thoughts and unfamiliar feelings. For 3 decades, Thorne's life had been governed by routine and predictability, by the comfort that came from knowing exactly what each day would bring. But now, everything seemed uncertain, as if the landscape itself had shifted while he wasn't paying attention. He spent the rest of the day in a state of distracted contemplation, going through the motions of his usual responsibilities, while his mind wrestled with the implications of what had happened beneath the sycamore tree. The ranch hands noticed his distraction but wisely chose not to comment, recognizing that their typically unflappable boss was dealing with something that went beyond the normal concerns of cattle and weather. That evening, as Thorne sat alone in his study reviewing financial reports, he found himself thinking about Ella's poetry and the emotions it had awakened. The tears had stopped flowing, but their memory remained vivid, a reminder that beneath his carefully constructed facade, he was still capable of feeling the full range of human emotion. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, like discovering that he possessed a sense he had never known existed. For so long, he had lived in a world of muted grays, where efficiency and control took precedence over joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain. But Ella's poetry had reminded him that life was meant to be experienced in full color, with all the risks and rewards that such vivid existence entailed. Over the following days, Thorne found himself drawn repeatedly to the sycamore tree, hoping to encounter Ella during her morning reading sessions. He told himself that his interest was purely practical, that he was simply monitoring activities on his property, as any responsible landowner would do. But he knew that wasn't the complete truth. The truth was that he had become fascinated by this small woman, who seemed to carry light wherever she went, who could find beauty in simple moments and express complex emotions with an ease that both amazed and intimidated him. He wanted to understand how she had maintained her capacity for wonder and joy, how she had avoided the cynicism and hardness that seemed to be the inevitable result of dealing with an unpredictable world. His opportunity came the following Wednesday when he encountered her walking along the fence line that separated his property from the county road. She was carrying a small canvas bag and moved with the purposeful stride of someone on a specific mission. But when she saw him approaching on horseback, she stopped and offered the same welcoming smile that had become so familiar. "Good morning, Mr. Wilder," she called out, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Beautiful day for a ride, isn't it?" Thorne dismounted and approached her with the careful steps of someone venturing into unfamiliar territory. "Miss Patterson, Ella, what brings you out so early?" "I'm collecting wildflowers for a science lesson," she replied, opening her bag to show him the colorful specimens she had already gathered. "The children are studying plant identification, and I thought real examples would be more interesting than pictures in a book." She pulled out a cluster of bluebonnets, their vibrant colors startling against her pale hands. "Texas has such incredible botanical diversity. I found 17 different species just along this stretch of fence line." Thorne found himself genuinely interested in her discoveries, seeing his familiar landscape through her eyes and recognizing beauty that he had learned to take for granted. "My grandmother used to know the names of every flower on the ranch," he said, surprising himself with this personal revelation. "She tried to teach me when I was young, but I was more interested in horses and cattle." "It's never too late to learn," Ella replied, her eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm that seemed to characterize everything she did. "Plants have such fascinating stories to tell, if you know how to listen to them." She gestured toward a cluster of Indian paintbrush that grew wild along the fence. "These flowers, for instance, are partially parasitic. They tap into the root systems of other plants to supplement their own nutrition. It's a perfect example of how nature finds ways to adapt and survive in challenging conditions." As she spoke, Thorne found himself drawn into her explanations, discovering that her knowledge went far beyond the simple plant identification she had mentioned. She understood the complex relationships that connected different species, the ways in which seemingly separate organisms depended on each other for survival and growth. "You really love teaching, don't you?" he said, recognizing something in her expression that reminded him of his own passion for ranch management. "I love learning," she corrected gently. "Teaching is just a way of sharing that love with others. There's something magical about watching a child's face light up when they suddenly understand a concept that seemed impossible just moments before." They walked together along the fence line, Ella pointing out different species and sharing stories about their characteristics and uses. Thorne found himself relaxing in her company in ways that he hadn't experienced in decades, discovering that conversation could be about more than business transactions and practical concerns. "I heard you reading poetry the other morning," he said suddenly, the words emerging before he could reconsider their wisdom. Under the sycamore tree, Ella's cheeks flushed slightly, but her smile remained steady. "I hope I wasn't disturbing anyone. I like to read aloud sometimes, especially poetry. There's something about hearing the words that makes them more powerful than reading silently." "What kind of poetry do you prefer?" Thorne asked, genuinely curious about the literature that had affected him so profoundly. "All kinds, really, but I'm particularly drawn to poets who write about hope and resilience, about finding light in dark places," she replied. "There's so much beauty in the world, even when we're going through difficult times. Sometimes we just need someone to help us remember how to see it." Her words carried a weight that suggested personal experience with the darkness she mentioned, and Thorne found himself wondering what challenges she had faced in her own life. Despite her obvious optimism and warmth, there was something in her eyes that spoke of pain overcome rather than pain avoided. "Would you—" he began, then stopped, uncertain how to frame his request without revealing too much about his own emotional state. "Would I what?" Ella prompted gently, her expression encouraging rather than impatient. "Would you be willing to share some of your favorite poems with me?" he asked finally. "I don't know much about poetry, but what I heard the other morning was quite moving." Ella's face lit up with genuine delight, and she clasped her hands together in the gesture that Thorne was beginning to recognize as a sign of her excitement. Oh, I would love that. Poetry is meant to be shared, and I have so many favorites that I'd be happy to introduce you to. She paused, studying his face with the perceptive attention that always made him feel slightly exposed. Are you interested in any particular themes or styles? Some people prefer more traditional forms, while others are drawn to contemporary free verse. Thorne realized that he had no frame of reference for such distinctions, having spent most of his life avoiding anything that might stir up unwanted emotions. I trust your judgment, he said. Whatever you think might be appropriate for someone who's new to poetry. Wonderful, Ella replied, her enthusiasm evident in every word. I'll put together a small collection of some of my favorites, pieces that speak to different aspects of the human experience. We could meet under the sycamore tree, if you'd like. It seems like the perfect setting for poetry. The idea of deliberately exposing himself to the emotional intensity he had experienced during his hidden observation filled Thorne with both anticipation and anxiety. But something about Ella's presence made the risk seem worthwhile, as if her genuine warmth might provide protection against the overwhelming feelings that poetry seemed to generate. That sounds acceptable, he said, falling back on formal language as a way to maintain some emotional distance, even while agreeing to an arrangement that was anything but formal. They agreed to meet the following morning at sunrise, when the light would be soft and the world still quiet enough for poetry to be heard properly. As they parted ways, Thorne found himself looking forward to the encounter with an eagerness that surprised him, a feeling that had been absent from his life for so long that he had almost forgotten its existence. That evening, he found himself unable to concentrate on his usual routine of reviewing reports and planning the next day's activities. Instead, he wandered through his house, seeing it with fresh eyes and recognizing how sterile and unwelcoming it had become over the years. The rooms were clean and well-maintained, but they contained no personal touches that might reveal anything about the man who lived there. The walls were bare except for a few landscapes that had come with the house, and the furniture was chosen for durability rather than comfort or beauty. For the first time in decades, Thorne found himself wondering what a visitor might think of his home. Whether someone like Ella would see it as a reflection of strength and self-sufficiency, or simply as evidence of a life lived without joy or meaningful connection. The realization troubled him more than he cared to admit, forcing him to confront the possibility that his carefully constructed existence might be less admirable than he had always believed. He had built walls to protect himself from pain, but those same walls had also blocked out light and warmth, and all the small pleasures that made life worth living. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of his childhood and fragments of the poetry he had heard Ella reading. He woke before dawn, feeling restless and uncertain, emotions that were foreign to his usual experience of confident control. As he dressed and prepared for the meeting, Thorne caught sight of himself in the mirror and paused, studying the reflection of a man he barely recognized. The face looking back at him still bore the weathered features and steel-gray eyes that had earned him his reputation, but something had changed in the past few days. There was a softness around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability that made him look more human and less like the implacable force of nature he had cultivated for so many years. The walk to the sycamore tree felt longer than usual, each step carrying him further from the safety of his established routine, and closer to an encounter that might change everything he thought he knew about himself. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of birds beginning their daily songs and the distant lowing of cattle settling into their grazing patterns. Ella was already there when he arrived, sitting cross-legged on a blanket she had spread beneath the tree's massive canopy. She wore a dress of soft green that complemented her auburn hair, and her face was turned toward the eastern horizon where the sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Good morning, Thorne," she said, using his first name for the first time, and somehow making it sound natural rather than presumptuous. "Isn't this the most beautiful time of day? There's something magical about sunrise, the way it makes everything seem possible again." Thorne settled himself on the blanket beside her, maintaining a careful distance that reflected his uncertainty about the appropriate boundaries for this new kind of interaction. "I've always been an early riser," he said, "but I usually spend sunrise checking on the cattle or reviewing the day's work schedule. I don't think I've ever just sat and watched it happen." "Then you've been missing one of life's great pleasures," Ella replied, her voice warm with genuine sympathy for what he had denied himself. "There's something about witnessing the daily rebirth of the world that puts everything else in perspective. It reminds us that no matter how difficult yesterday was, today offers fresh possibilities." She reached into a small bag beside her and withdrew the leather-bound book he had seen her reading before, along with several sheets of paper covered with her neat handwriting. "I've selected some poems that I think might speak to you," she said. "Some are about nature and the land, others about courage and resilience, and a few about the connections that bind us all together." As she opened her book to the first selection, Thorne felt his heart rate increase slightly, anticipating the emotional intensity he had experienced during his hidden observation. But being here with Ella's permission, sharing the experience rather than stealing it, created a completely different dynamic. "This first one is by Robert Frost," she said, her voice taking on the musical quality that made her reading so compelling. "It's called The Road Not Taken, and it's about choices and the courage required to follow our own path." As she read the familiar verses about roads diverging in a yellow wood, Thorne found himself thinking about the choices he had made over the past 30 years. The path of isolation and emotional self-protection that had brought him both success and profound loneliness. The poem's conclusion, about taking the road less traveled and how that choice had made all the difference, resonated with questions he was only beginning to ask himself. "What do you think?" Ella asked when she finished, her green eyes studying his face with the perceptive attention that always made him feel slightly transparent. "I'm not sure I've ever really made a choice," Thorne admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "Most of my decisions have been reactions to circumstances, ways of protecting myself rather than pursuing something I actually wanted." Ella nodded thoughtfully, as if his answer had confirmed something she had already suspected. "That's very insightful. It takes tremendous courage to recognize that pattern, and even more courage to consider changing it." She turned to another page, her fingers gentle on the worn paper. "This next poem is by Maya Angelou. It's called Still I Rise, and it's about finding strength in the face of adversity, about refusing to be defined by the things that have hurt us." The words that followed were powerful and defiant, speaking of resilience and dignity maintained despite attempts to break the human spirit. As Ella read about rising like dust, like air, like hope springing high, Thorne felt something stirring within him that he could only describe as recognition. "She writes about pain as if it were a teacher rather than an enemy," he said when the poem ended. "As if the things that hurt us might also make us stronger." "Exactly," Ella replied, her smile bright with approval at his understanding. "Pain is inevitable in life, but suffering is often a choice we make by refusing to learn from our experiences or allow them to transform us into something better than we were before." She read several more poems, each one seeming to speak directly to aspects of Thorne's experience that he had never been able to articulate. There were verses about solitude and connection, about the courage required to be vulnerable, about the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds through love and understanding. With each poem, Thorne felt his carefully constructed defenses continuing to crumble, not in the sudden collapse he had feared, but in a gradual melting that felt more like relief than destruction. The emotions that had been locked away for so long were finding their way to the surface, not as the overwhelming flood he had dreaded, but as a gentle stream that carried away years of accumulated pain and loneliness. "There's one more I'd like to share," Ella said, her voice taking on a note of gentle hesitation that suggested this final selection held special significance. "It's by Rainer Maria Rilke, and it's about love and the courage required to truly open our hearts to another person." As she read the verses about love consisting in the mutual guarding and honoring of solitudes, about the work of loving being, the learning to see another soul clearly, Thorne felt tears beginning to form in his eyes once grat. Again. But this time, he didn't try to hide or suppress them, allowing them to flow freely as he absorbed the profound truth of what he was hearing. When Ella finished reading, she looked up to find his face wet with tears, and her own eyes immediately filled with compassionate understanding. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and withdrew a clean handkerchief, offering it to him with a gesture that was both practical and infinitely gentle. "I'm sorry," Thorne said, accepting the handkerchief gratefully. I haven't cried in 30 years. There's nothing to apologize for, Ella replied, her voice warm with acceptance. Tears are just the heart's way of speaking when words aren't enough. There's no shame in feeling deeply, especially when you've been brave enough to let yourself be vulnerable. They sat together in comfortable silence, as Thorn composed himself, the morning sun climbing higher and filling the world with golden light that seemed to make everything look more beautiful and hopeful. The tears had brought a sense of release that he hadn't expected, as if a weight he had carried for decades had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said finally, meeting her eyes with a directness that would have been impossible just days earlier. "For sharing those poems with me, and for—" he struggled to find words for what she had given him. "For helping me remember that I'm still human." Ella's smile was radiant, filled with a joy that seemed to illuminate her entire being. "We're all human, Thorn. Sometimes we just forget, or we convince ourselves that feeling nothing is safer than risking everything. But safety isn't really living, is it?" As they packed up her books and prepared to return to their respective responsibilities, Thorn found himself reluctant to end this unexpected communion. The world looked different now, brighter and more full of possibility than it had seemed in decades. "Would you—" he began, then stopped, uncertain how to frame his request. "Would I what?" Ella prompted, the same gentle encouragement in her voice that she had used before. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" he asked, the words coming out in a rush before his habitual caution could prevent them. "At my house. I realize it's presumptuous, and you probably have other obligations, but I would very much like to continue our conversation." Ella's face lit up with genuine pleasure at his invitation. "I would love that," she said. "What time would be convenient for you?" 7 o'clock? Thorn suggested, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror at what he had just committed himself to. 7 o'clock is perfect, Ella agreed. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Thorn replied, then added with a hesitant smile that felt foreign on his face, "And maybe another poem or two, if you're willing to share them." As they walked back toward their respective homes, Thorn found himself paying attention to details that had escaped his notice for years. The way the morning light played across the grassland, the intricate patterns of wildflowers that Ella had taught him to see, the sound of her laughter when a butterfly landed briefly on her outstretched hand. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy as Thorn attempted to prepare for an evening that would be unlike anything he had experienced in decades. He found himself cleaning his house, with an attention to detail that went far beyond his usual standards, arranging flowers from his property in vases that had sat empty for years, and even attempting to cook a meal that would be worthy of his guest. His housekeeper, Margaret, arrived for her usual afternoon cleaning to find her typically unflappable employer in a state of barely controlled panic, frantically rearranging furniture and muttering about whether the dining room was too formal for what was supposed to be a casual dinner. "Mr. Wilder," she said, her voice carrying the fond exasperation of someone who had worked for him for 15 years. "If you don't mind my saying so, you're acting like a schoolboy preparing for his first dance. Who is this mysterious dinner guest who has you so rattled?" Thorn paused in his frantic cleaning, realizing that his behavior must seem completely irrational to someone who knew his usual habits. "Her name is Ella Patterson," he said. "She's the new teacher at the old schoolhouse. We've been talking about poetry." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise, but her expression quickly softened into something that looked like hope mixed with maternal concern. "Poetry, is it? Well, that's a fine thing for a man to be interested in. And this Miss Patterson, she's a nice young woman? She's—" Thorn struggled to find words that would capture the essence of what made Ella so special. "She's unlike anyone I've ever met. She sees beauty everywhere, and she has this way of making you believe that the world is full of possibilities you never noticed before." Margaret's smile was knowing and gentle. "Sounds like someone worth making an effort for," she said. "Now, what can I do to help you prepare for this dinner? Because if you don't mind my saying so, you look like you could use some assistance." With Margaret's help, Thorn managed to transform his sterile house into something approaching a welcoming home. Candles were lit throughout the main rooms, creating a warm glow that softened the harsh edges of furniture chosen for durability rather than beauty. Flowers from the ranch were arranged in every available vase, filling the air with the sweet scents of jasmine and honeysuckle. The menu was kept simple but elegant, featuring a roast prepared with herbs from the garden Ella had planted and vegetables grown on the ranch. Margaret had insisted on baking fresh bread and preparing a dessert that would, in her words, show the young lady that you're a man worth knowing. As 7 o'clock approached, Thorne found himself changing clothes for the third time, finally settling on a white shirt and dark trousers that made him look less like a rancher and more like the successful businessman he had become. His hands were actually shaking as he waited for Ella's arrival, a physical manifestation of nervousness that he hadn't experienced since his teenage years. The knock on his door came precisely at 7, and when Thorne opened it, he found Ella standing on his front porch wearing a dress of deep blue that made her eyes seem even more luminous than usual. She had pinned her auburn hair up in a style that was both elegant and natural, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that perfectly complemented the arrangements he had placed throughout the house. "Good evening, Thorne," she said, offering him the flowers with a smile that seemed to light up the gathering dusk. "These are from the meadow behind the schoolhouse. I thought they might brighten your table." "They're beautiful," he replied, accepting the bouquet and breathing in their delicate fragrance. "Thank you for coming. Please, come in." As Ella stepped into his house, Thorne watched her face carefully, curious about her reaction to his home and the effort he had made to prepare for her visit. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the candles and flowers, the warm lighting that transformed familiar spaces into something magical and welcoming. "Oh, Thorne," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. "This is lovely. You've created such a warm and inviting atmosphere." Relief flooded through him at her approval, followed by a surge of pride that he had managed to please someone whose opinion had become so important to him. "I wanted everything to be perfect," he admitted. "I haven't entertained anyone in a very long time." "It shows that you care," Ella replied, her smile warm with understanding. "That's what makes it perfect." The evening that followed exceeded even Thorne's most optimistic expectations. The conversation flowed as naturally as it had that morning beneath the sycamore tree, moving seamlessly from poetry to philosophy to shared stories about their respective childhoods and dreams. Ella told him about growing up in a small town in Oklahoma, the daughter of a librarian and a music teacher who had filled their home with books and songs and endless encouragement to pursue whatever sparked their daughter's brass curiosity. She had always known she wanted to be a teacher, she explained, drawn by the opportunity to help others discover the joy of learning and the power of knowledge to transform lives. In return, Thorne found himself sharing memories that he hadn't spoken of in decades, stories about his parents and the dreams they had held for their son, about his grandfather's wisdom and the lessons he had learned during those early years on the ranch. For the first time, he spoke about his parents' death, not as a simple fact to be acknowledged, but as a loss that had shaped everything that followed. "I think I stopped believing in the possibility of happiness after they died," he said, the words emerging with an honesty that surprised him. "It seems safer to expect nothing than to risk losing everything again." Ella listened with the same attentive compassion she had shown that morning, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than pity. "Grief has a way of convincing us that love inevitably leads to pain," she said. "But what if the pain is just the price we pay for having experienced something beautiful? What if the real tragedy isn't in loving and losing, but in never allowing ourselves to love at all?" Her words hit him with the force of revelation, reframing experiences he had carried for 30 years and offering a perspective that made healing seem possible rather than impossible. The evening continued with more poetry reading, Ella sharing verses that spoke of hope and renewal, of the courage required to begin again after loss. As the night grew later and their conversation deeper, Thorne found himself marveling at the transformation that had occurred in just a few short days. The man who had built his reputation on emotional invulnerability was discovering that true strength might lie, not in avoiding feeling, but in embracing it fully. When Ella finally prepared to leave, well past 10 o'clock, Thorne found himself reluctant to end an evening that had been more meaningful than any he could remember. As he walked her to the door, she turned to face him with an expression that seemed to hold infinite tenderness. "Thank you for tonight," she said. for your trust and your honesty, and for letting me see the real man behind the reputation. You're not nearly as scary as people think you are." "What am I, then?" Thorn asked, genuinely curious about her perception of him. "You're someone who's been hurt and learned to protect himself, but who still has an enormous capacity for love and kindness," she replied. "You're someone who's been waiting for the right person to remind you that it's safe to feel again." Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, a gesture that was both innocent and profound in its impact. "Good night, Thorn," she whispered. "Sweet dreams." As she walked back toward the schoolhouse, Thorn stood in his doorway watching until her figure disappeared into the darkness, his hand touching the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. The simple gesture had stirred feelings that went far beyond mere physical attraction, touching something deeper and more fundamental than he had known existed. That night, he slept more peacefully than he had in years, his dreams filled not with the nightmares of loss and isolation that had haunted him for decades, but with images of light and laughter, of shared conversations and gentle touches that promised possibilities he was only beginning to imagine. Over the following weeks, Thorn and Ella fell into a routine that brought structure and meaning to both their lives. They met most mornings beneath the sycamore tree, sharing poetry and conversation as the sun rose over the Texas landscape. Their discussions ranged across every conceivable topic, from literature and philosophy to practical matters of ranch management and education. Ella proved to be not only a gifted teacher, but also an intelligent conversationalist who challenged Thorn's assumptions and encouraged him to see familiar situations from new perspectives. Her questions were never accusatory or judgmental, but they pushed him to examine his beliefs and motivations with an honesty that was both uncomfortable and liberating. In return, Thorn found himself sharing knowledge and experiences that he had never thought would interest anyone else. He told her stories about the land and its history, about the challenges of running a large operation, and the satisfaction that came from building something lasting and meaningful. She listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed her respect for his expertise and achievements. Their evening dinners became a regular occurrence, sometimes at his house and sometimes in the more modest quarters of the schoolhouse. Ella proved to be an excellent cook, preparing meals with the same care and attention she brought to everything else in her life. More importantly, she had a gift for creating atmosphere, transforming any space into a place where meaningful conversation could flourish. These shared meals became opportunities for deeper exploration of each other's thoughts and feelings, conversations that gradually revealed the complex individuals behind their public personas. Thorn learned that Ella's optimism and warmth were not signs of naivety, but rather conscious choices made in full awareness of life's difficulties and disappointments. She had faced her own share of challenges, including the loss of her mother to a long illness and a broken engagement to a man who had ultimately proved unable to accept her independence and dedication to her career. But rather than allowing these experiences to make her bitter or cynical, she had used them as opportunities for growth and self-discovery. "I decided long ago that I could either let life's disappointments define me or use them to become stronger and more compassionate," she explained one evening as they sat on his front porch watching the sunset. "Pain is inevitable, but how we respond to it is a choice we make every day." Her philosophy challenged everything Thorn had believed about self-protection and emotional survival, forcing him to reconsider strategies that had served him for decades but had also isolated him from most of what made life meaningful. Under her gentle influence, he began to experiment with vulnerability, sharing thoughts and feelings that he had kept locked away for years. The changes in Thorn were noticeable to everyone around him, though few people could identify exactly what was different. His ranch hands observed that their typically stern boss had become more patient and understanding, more likely to offer encouragement than criticism when things went wrong. The townspeople noticed that he smiled more often and seemed genuinely interested in their welfare, rather than simply going through the motions of polite conversation. But the most significant changes were internal, visible only to Thorn himself and to Ella, who watched his transformation with the satisfaction of a gardener tending a plant that had finally begun to bloom. He was learning to experience emotions without being overwhelmed by them, to find strength in openness rather than in isolation. The turning point came on a warm evening in late spring, when Ella arrived for dinner carrying not just her usual contribution of fresh-baked bread, but also a small wrapped package that she presented to him with obvious excitement. "I have something for you," she said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "It's not much, but I thought you might appreciate it." Inside the package was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting to be filled. The cover was embossed with the simple design of a sycamore tree, and the craftsmanship was clearly that of a skilled artisan who had taken pride in creating something both beautiful and functional. "I thought you might like to try writing some of your own thoughts and feelings," Ella explained. "Poetry doesn't have to rhyme or follow any particular form. Sometimes the most powerful verses are simply honest expressions of what's in our hearts." Thorne held the journal in his hands, feeling the weight of both the gift itself and the trust it represented. The idea of putting his private thoughts on paper seemed simultaneously terrifying and appealing, a step toward complete honesty that would require courage he wasn't sure he possessed. "I don't know if I have anything worth writing," he said, his voice uncertain. "Everyone has something worth writing," Ella replied with characteristic confidence. "You've lived an extraordinary life, Thorne. You've experienced loss and triumph, solitude and connection. Those experiences have shaped you into someone with unique insights and perspectives that deserve to be preserved and shared." That night, after Ella had returned to the schoolhouse, Thorne sat at his desk with the journal open before him, a pen in his hand, and his mind filled with competing thoughts and emotions. For more than an hour, he stared at the blank page, overwhelmed by the possibilities and paralyzed by the fear of inadequacy. Finally, he began to write, not poetry, but simple prose that attempted to capture the journey he had been on since Ella's arrival in his life. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing fluency, as he found his voice and discovered that honest expression was easier than he had anticipated. He wrote about the morning when he had first heard her reading poetry beneath the sycamore tree, about the tears that had surprised him with their intensity, and the gradual awakening of feelings he had thought were permanently buried. He wrote about the fear and excitement of allowing someone to see beyond the facade he had maintained for so long, about the discovery that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness. When he finally set down his pen, several hours had passed, and the journal contained pages of thoughts and observations that were more honest than anything he had ever shared with another human being. The act of writing had been cathartic, providing a new way to process experiences and emotions that had previously seemed too complex or overwhelming to understand. The next morning, he brought the journal with him to his meeting with Ella beneath the sycamore tree. Though he made no mention of having used her gift, she seemed to sense something different about him, studying his face with the perceptive attention that always made him feel transparent. "You wrote something," she said, her statement rather than a question. "I can see it in your eyes. There's a kind of peace that comes from putting difficult truths into words." "How did you know?" Thorne asked, genuinely curious about her ability to read his emotional state so accurately. "Because I've been there," she replied simply. "Writing saved my life during some very dark periods. There's something magical about seeing your thoughts and feelings on paper, about discovering that you can make sense of experiences that seemed incomprehensible." She gestured toward the journal he held in his hands. "Would you be willing to share what you wrote?" "Only if you're comfortable, of course. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is allow another person to witness our truth." The request filled Thorne with the same mixture of terror and anticipation he had experienced before their first dinner together. Sharing his writing would represent a level of vulnerability that went beyond anything he had previously risked, an exposure of his innermost thoughts and feelings that could never be taken back. But as he looked into Ella's eyes and saw the compassion and acceptance that had characterized their entire relationship, he found the courage to open the journal and begin reading aloud the words he had written in the solitude of his study. His voice was uncertain at first, stumbling over phrases that had seemed eloquent when written in private, but now sounded clumsy and inadequate. But as he continued reading, gaining confidence from Ella's encouraging attention and supportive nods, he began to hear his own words differently. What he had written was not poetry in any traditional sense, but it was honest and heartfelt. a genuine attempt to make sense of experiences that had transformed him in ways he was still discovering. He had captured something essential about the journey from isolation to connection, about the courage required to trust another person with the most fragile parts of oneself. When he finished reading, Ella was quiet for a long moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and her expression filled with something that looked like wonder. "That was beautiful, Thorn," she said finally, her voice soft with emotion. Not just the words themselves, but the courage it took to write them and the generosity it took to share them with me. You have a gift for expressing complex emotions with clarity and power. Her praise filled him with a warmth that went beyond simple pleasure at being complimented, touching something deeper that had to do with being truly seen and understood by another person. For the first time in his adult life, Thorn felt completely accepted for who he really was, rather than for what he had accomplished or the image he had projected. "I want to share something with you too," Ella said, reaching into her bag and withdrawing a small notebook that was clearly well-used and much loved. "These are some of my own writings, poems and thoughts I've collected over the years. I've never shared them with anyone before, but I think you'll understand them." As she read from her own work, Thorn was struck by the beauty and insight of her words, verses that revealed depths of experience and understanding he had only glimpsed in their conversations. She wrote about loss and healing, about the choice between bitterness and hope, about the courage required to remain open to love, despite the risks it entailed. One poem in particular spoke to him with unusual power, verses about learning to see oneself through the eyes of someone who loved you, about discovering that the flaws you had considered unforgivable might actually be part of what made you worthy of love. "You wrote that?" he asked when she finished, amazed that someone could capture such complex emotions with such simple, elegant language. "I wrote it about someone I was falling in love with," she admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly, but her gaze remaining steady. Someone who couldn't see his own worth because he was so focused on protecting himself from further hurt. The implications of her words hit Thorn with the force of a physical blow, filling him with a mixture of joy and terror that left him momentarily speechless. The idea that Ella might harbor romantic feelings for him was something he had barely dared to hope for, despite the growing intimacy of their relationship. "Ella," he began, then stopped, struggling to find words adequate to express the complexity of his own feelings. "I know this might complicate things," she said, her voice gentle but determined. "And I don't want to pressure you or make you uncomfortable. But I also couldn't keep pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship." Thorn set down his journal and reached for her hands, holding them gently as he tried to organize thoughts that seemed to be moving too quickly for rational analysis. The woman sitting beside him had transformed his life in ways he was still discovering, awakening parts of himself that he had thought were permanently buried. "You haven't complicated anything," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "You've made everything make sense for the first time in 30 years. I've been falling in love with you since that first morning when I heard you reading poetry, but I was too scared to admit it even to myself." Ella's smile was radiant, illuminating her entire face with a joy that seemed to transform the world around them. "Really?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "You're not just saying that to be kind?" "I've never been kind just for the sake of kindness," Thorn replied, managing a smile that felt more natural than any expression he had worn in decades. "Everything I've told you has been the truth, including this. I love you, Ella Patterson, and I can't imagine how I survived all those years without you." The kiss that followed was gentle and sweet, filled with promise rather than passion, a seal on feelings that had been building for weeks, but had finally found their voice. When they separated, both were crying, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow, evidence of hearts that had finally found their home. "So, what happens now?" Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now we figure out how to build a life together," Thorn replied, speaking with a certainty that surprised him. "If you're willing to take on a stubborn cowboy who's still learning how to feel." "I can't think of anything I'd rather do," Ella said, laughing with pure happiness. "Though I should warn you that I come with a classroom full of children and a tendency to find beauty in the most unlikely places." "I'm counting on both," Thorn replied, pulling her closer and marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. "I need someone to teach me how to see the world the way you do." The engagement was announced 6 months later, after a courtship that became the talk of Cedar Falls and the surrounding countryside. Nobody could quite believe that the legendary Stoneface Wilder had finally met his match in the form of a soft-spoken schoolteacher who somehow managed to make him smile in public and even laugh at children's antics during school programs. The wedding was held the following spring beneath the sycamore tree, where their love had first bloomed, with the entire community in attendance to witness the union of two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of their souls. Ella wore her grandmother's wedding dress, simple but elegant, and Thorne had commissioned a special suit that made him look less like a rancher and more like the successful businessman he had become. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with vows they had written themselves that spoke of partnership and growth, of the courage to remain vulnerable, and the strength found in mutual support. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the applause from their guests was thunderous, a celebration not just of their union, but of the transformation they had both undergone. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Thorne marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. The man who had once believed that feeling nothing was safer than risking everything had discovered that love was not a weakness to be avoided, but a strength to be cultivated and cherished. "No regrets?" Ella asked, her voice soft against his ear, as they swayed to music played by a small band composed of local musicians. "Only that it took me 42 years to find you," Thorne replied, spinning her gently and enjoying the way her laughter rang out across the assembled crowd. "But I suppose some things are worth waiting for." Their marriage proved to be everything their courtship had promised, and more. Ella brought light and warmth to every corner of Thorne's previously sterile house, filling it with flowers and books, laughter and music. The sounds of children who came to visit their beloved teacher and stayed to be charmed by her mysterious husband. Thorne, in turn, provided Ella with the security and support that allowed her teaching career to flourish in ways she had never imagined possible. With his backing, she was able to expand the school program, adding resources and opportunities that attracted families from throughout the region, and establishing Cedar Falls as a center of educational excellence. But their greatest achievement was the love they built together, a partnership that grew stronger with each passing year as they learned to navigate life's challenges as a team rather than as isolated individuals. They faced difficulties, of course, the normal struggles that come with merging two lives and learning to compromise and communicate effectively. Yet through it all, they maintained the foundation of honesty and vulnerability that had brought them together, never allowing fear or pride to prevent them from sharing their deepest thoughts and feelings. Their morning meetings beneath the sycamore tree continued throughout their marriage, evolving from courtship ritual to established tradition that anchored their relationship in shared reflection and mutual support. 10 years after their wedding, as they sat beneath the same tree where Thorne had first learned to cry again, Ella reading poetry to their twin children, while he worked on his own writing, he reflected on the man he had become and the life they had built together. The transformation was complete but ongoing, a daily choice to remain open to feeling and connection rather than retreating into the safety of emotional isolation. He had learned that love was indeed a risk, but it was a risk worth taking, offering rewards that made all the vulnerability and uncertainty worthwhile. "What are you thinking about?" Ella asked, noticing his contemplative expression as their children played nearby, their laughter adding music to the afternoon air. "I'm thinking about the morning I first heard you reading poetry under this tree," Thorne replied, reaching for her hand and marveling, as he did every day, at the fact that she had chosen to share her life with him. "About how one person can change everything if you're brave enough to let them." "We changed each other," Ella corrected gently, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. "That's what love does. It makes us better than we could ever be alone." As the sun set over the Texas landscape they both loved, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded them of their first shared sunrise, Thorne Wilde reflected on the truth of her words. He had indeed learned to cry again. But more importantly, he had learned to live again, to embrace the full spectrum of human emotion and experience. The giant cowboy, who had once been known as Stoneface, had discovered that true strength lay not in avoiding feeling, but in embracing it fully. Not in protecting himself from love, but in opening his heart to all the joy and sorrow, beauty and pain that came with being truly alive. And as their children's laughter echoed across the land that had been in his family for generations, Thorn knew that the legacy he would leave behind would be measured not in acres owned or cattle raised, but in love shared and hearts opened, in the courage to feel deeply and the wisdom to know that some risks are always worth taking. The poetry that had awakened his sleeping heart continued to flow from both their pens, capturing in words the miracle of transformation that love could work in even the most guarded soul. But the greatest poem they created together was not written on paper, but lived out in the daily choices they made to remain vulnerable, to keep growing, and to never stop believing in the power of one heart to heal another. Years later, when visitors came to hear the story of how the legendary Stoneface Wilder had been transformed by love, they would find him under the sycamore tree with his wife and children, reading poetry aloud in a voice that carried the warmth of tears freely shed and a heart completely